Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lobsang, and on behalf of the Tibetan community in Britain, I have the pleasure of welcoming you this evening to what I believe will be a thought-provoking discussion on climate change and the Tibetan Plateau. Climate issues have been widely discussed in the media recently, including the UK government's commitment to net zero emission. The UK government bids to host COP26, the next UN Summit on Climate Change in 2020. Will climate change end human civilization in 2050? School children protesting for climate justice, and a car-free day in London. Not least, President Trump and Prince Charles discussing on climate change. The fact that the Tibetan Plateau is on the front line of climate change, that its fragile ecosystem has become the scene of twin destructive forces of melting glaciers and rapid desertification, seems to be overshadowed with news such as Tibetans carry a Denisovan gene that helps them adapt to high altitude. Cannabis may have originated on the Tibetan Plateau. Here I make an exception and acknowledge the BBC article last Wednesday by Rebecca Morrell on Himalayan glaciers. Maybe things are changing as we speak here today. To emphasize the key role of the Tibetan Plateau in mitigating climate change, and to give us a glimpse into what our world may become in 2071, we are much honored to welcome here two eminent speakers, Sikyong Dr. Lobsang Sangay, President of Central Tibetan Administration, and Professor Chris Rapley, Professor of Climate Science at the UCL. We are delighted that none other than Emily Buchanan is chairing the session today. Emily is a multi-award-winning journalist with 30 years of broadcasting experience as the BBC producer, correspondent, and presenter. Currently, she is a regular presenter of Sunday program on BBC Radio 4, as well as an associate lecturer at Goldsmiths University. Before I hand over to Emily, I want to make a brief introduction of our organization. Tibetan Community in Britain is a grassroots-based civil society organization formed by the Tibetan population in the UK. It's managed by a volunteer council elected every 2 years. We also have a trust called the Tibetan Refugee Charitable Trust, and it supports Tibetan diaspora initiatives. To the many sponsors of our trust who have joined us here today in the audience, we extend a special welcome to you. I hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you. Over to Emily.
So thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really honoured to be here. And as you say, the environment is never off the news agenda these days. Even today, as I'm sure you all know, the Minister of State responsible for Asia has been suspended on account of removing rather forcefully a Greenpeace activist last night at the Mansion House dinner. So a very hot topic. And where better to focus than on Tibet with its underreported importance as an environmental red flag for global warming and its vital role in influencing water supplies across a vast region. And we have two guests preeminent in their field. Sikyong Dr. Lobsang Sangay, a real high flyer, Fulbright scholar, the first Tibetan to win that award from the Harvard Law School, an expert in international human rights law, democratic constitutionalism and conflict resolution, I think we need you here in the UK, please. A bridge builder, organising major conferences with Chinese, Tibetan, Indian and Western scholars. And in 2007, he was selected as one of the 24 young leaders of Asia by the Asia Society. And in 2011, he was elected by the Tibetan diaspora to the post of Sikyong, formerly known as Kalam Tripa, Prime Minister. And he was then re-elected in 2016 for a second term as a leader of the Central Tibetan Administration. On his left is Professor Chris Rapley, CBE. He's Professor of Climate Science at UCL, Fellow of St Edmund's College, Cambridge, Chairman of the London Climate Change Partnership, and he was Director of the Science Museum and of the British Antarctic Survey. And on top of all of that, he has a secret talent as a thespian. With the playwright Duncan Macmillan, he wrote 2071, or 2071, which he performed at the Royal Court as a one-man show back in 2014. And it got 5-star reviews and was described as absolutely necessary to see, just not an optional thing, but necessary. So I'm very curious to know 5 years later where we are now, what he's got planned for the theatre. And he was also a consultant to the BBC for the David Attenborough programme, Climate Change, The Facts. So if we could start first with Sikyong, and there will be time for questions afterwards, so each speaker was going to speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time to ask them questions.
Thank you, Rosella and Emily, for your kind introduction. And I'm glad that today the Tibetan community is organizing this event. And I hope similar events will be organized in the future as well. It's important that Tibetans take the initiative and organize such kind of events so that we can create awareness about Tibet and Tibet-related issues. I think Emily rightly said that I'm high-flying, but as far as environment is concerned, I think we have Chris as the expert here. So I'm high-flying, I just show up and say a few things on any topic that I'm assigned to, because I barely have a diploma on environmental law, but Chris, as a professor, I think his monologue on climate change was so popular that he was called back to perform again. So he's going to perform and share his expertise. So he's the main speaker. So that's how you should rate this talk, okay? Now, as far as Tibetan environment is concerned, Tibet is called the third pole. After Antarctica and Arctic, Tibet has the third highest reserve of ice. And the difference is that Antarctica and Arctic, when they melt, it goes to ocean, actually. But as far as Tibetan glaciers are concerned, when they melt, it forms streams, rivers, and some environmentalists estimate, some say the 6 largest rivers, or 8 largest rivers. But anyway, 10 large rivers of Asia flow from Tibet. And it's a lifeline for many countries downstream. For example, Brahmaputra River, which is a lifeline for northeast of India, particularly Assam, and Bangladesh. And then Salween River, Mekong River, Irrawaddy River, which are again lifeline for Southeast Asian countries. We all know about Mekong River from Vietnam War. And then Yangtze River in China and Yellow River, the cradle of Chinese civilization, all originate in Tibet. Now, as far as South Asia is concerned, Satluj River and Indus River both flow from Tibet. Now, interestingly, if you read newspapers, you find that Pakistan and India discussing about, I'm putting it mildly, about water sharing, Indus and Satluj. But both of them originate from Tibet. Now, particularly Indus River, the 40% of Indus River, the water, is direct glacier melt of Tibet, which means 40% of Indus River is Tibetan water. Now, coincidentally, we all know the term India, the name India came from Indus River. So if we have claim over or ownership over 40% of Indus River, we can claim 40% ownership of the word India as well. But for centuries, following Buddhism, we have shared water with all our neighboring countries, and presently it's estimated that 1.4 billion people depend on rivers starting from Tibet. Now, had we charged, now we all have water here. They now, you have to buy water nowadays. Had we charged for centuries, I think we could have been richer than Singapore as well. So, but as a Buddhist, I think we respected the natural flow of rivers and shared our water. And the Chinese government noticed it. And they felt maybe if we capture the water tower of Asia, they can control a lot of things, including many rivers that flow to China. Hence, at the moment, with the increasing urbanization of Tibetan Plateau, with a lot of Chinese moving in, with a lot of Chinese moving in, now we have to build houses for them, infrastructure, road, everything, and the the industrialization of the Tibetan Plateau. Because Tibet is very rich in minerals. Actually, not many people know that. And I have a list, according to Chinese government survey, Tibet has around 123 different kinds of minerals, which includes copper, gold, chromite, aluminum, iron, boron, lead, zinc, crude oil, potassium, natural gas, coal, and most importantly, or popularly, lithium. Because as you can see, some in the audience are taking pictures or videos of the presentation, and some of the phones are made in China. And why Chinese-made phones are cheaper than other phones is because the lithium is crucial for battery. Now, some environmentalists estimate that up to 70%, maybe 60% of lithium in China comes from Tibetan Plateau. So the extraction of lithium is very complicated. You have to use a lot of heat and chemical to extract lithium. In the process, you pollute Tibetan soil, you pollute Tibetan water, you pollute Tibetan air, but then they extract, and the local Tibetans don't get anything. So when you get Tibetan lithium for cheap, you make batteries and put it in Chinese-made gadgets, including phones or iPad, anything. So they sell it for free because they don't pay us anything. Similarly, at one time it's estimated that 90% of rare earth, again this is a very essential component for any kind of gadgets, comes from Inner Mongolia. Now Peru and some other countries have started extracting rare earth, but still it's estimated it's very high amount of rare earth comes from Inner Mongolia. Now, if foreign companies want to buy rare earth, they have to pay Chinese government deliberately to increase the price 10 times. Whereas Chinese companies, they can buy rare earth or extract rare earth from Inner Mongolia at a very cheap rate because they don't pay the locals. Now, when you have rare earth and lithium battery in any of the Chinese gadgets, Chinese-made gadgets, so they can sell it for free at our expense. So sometimes I say when your phone, or your phone's battery is dying, you should know that's Tibetan lithium which is dying. And so these are environmental implications, but also socio-economic and political implications as well. Now, because of the industrialization, because of the urbanization and deforestation, it's estimated that up to 46% of Tibetan forest was cut down from 1951, especially from 1960 on to 1985. Because deforestation was so much, it led to the major flood of Yangtze River. and estimated that it's up to 3,000 people died and 200,000 or 500,000 people were displaced. So because of severe deforestation, the Chinese people ultimately paid a huge price. Now all this deforestation, urbanization, industrialization, what it does is it increases temperature of the Tibetan Plateau. Now some scientists say that if there's 1 degree increase in temperature in the rest of the world, 2 degrees increase in temperature of the Tibetan Plateau. Now what it does is, when we talk of climate change and global warming, when the Tibetan Plateau temperature rises up, the glaciers of Tibet melt faster. So when you talk about glaciers, I think you might think of only snow, but if I put it in dramatic terms, Mount Everest could be without snow in the next 70 years. So you won't be climbing Mount Everest, but you will be climbing Rocky Everest. So there was an article from Nepal, very alarming. And BBC recently reported the same thing, the base camp of the Rongpo, the glaciers are melting the fastest. And because of glaciers melt, and what happens is that all the head of the rivers will be without water. Now 1.4 billion people depend on rivers flowing from Tibet. And what will happen to 1.4 billion people who depend on Tibetan rivers or rivers flowing from Tibet, especially those who make their living from agriculture or fishery? If rivers dry up, they won't have livelihood. So hence major implication. And again, it's, some scientists say that the jet stream over Tibet affects climate all the way to Europe. Whether the winter is warm or cold in Canada is partly dependent on the Tibetan Plateau. So I know I was told in England you call it, in London you call it flaming June, but I really don't see any heat here in England. So perhaps the heat wave is coming. When it gets too hot, you should remember the Tibetan Plateau is warming up and it's affecting the climate all over the world. So that's why I think there's environmentalists in San Francisco who have said, if you want to study climate change or global warming, you have to study Tibetan Plateau. Without understanding Tibetan Plateau, the study on climate change will be incomplete. And the scientists in Ottawa have said that, the scientists in various places have said that. Particularly, environmentalists in China have petitioned the Chinese government to declare Tibet as the third pole national park, so they can protect the Tibetan Plateau. What the Chinese environmentalists say is that we have to protect the Tibetan Plateau for our own sake, for our own rivers, for our own livelihood, and for our own, clean air. That's the state or the importance of the Tibetan Plateau. Even the Chinese environmentalists think it's very important to preserve. Hence, Tibet remains a vital factor in climate change and global warming. Now, if the temperature of Tibet keeps increasing, what will happen is that some scientists have estimated that up to 50% of the Tibetan glaciers have melted and disappeared. Now, NASA also estimates that by 2070, some say by 2070, alarmingly some say by 2050, but some say 2100, up to 70% of Tibetan glaciers could melt and disappear. So this is a very serious issue. Now, not only the people downstream will be deprived of water and livelihood, but what happens is that 70% of Tibetan Plateau is permafrost, which is frozen earth. Now, if glaciers melt very fast, temperature of the Tibetan Plateau increases, then Tibetan Plateau starts warming up. Then the permafrost, which is frozen earth, started thawing, it starts getting warm. Then what is underneath Tibetan Plateau could come up or could come out. And what is underneath the Tibetan Plateau? It's estimated 10,000 million tons of carbon dioxide is underneath the Tibetan Plateau. Now, if that is released, it doesn't matter. In London, I saw a lot of bicycles being promoted, to avoid riding cars or buses. But it doesn't matter, even if all the people in London start walking, don't use anything. Once that carbon dioxide is released, global warming as we know it will be nothing. Now, equal amount of methane is underneath the Tibetan Plateau. Now, methane, some estimate to be 20 times or 28 times more powerful or more harmful than carbon dioxide. If that is released, then I think we can, as far as global warming is concerned, that will be the end of even the discussion of global warming. So that's why Tibetan Plateau is so important as far as climate change and global warming is concerned. So perhaps, Emily, I can see you taking notes, so maybe you're indicating my time is up.
You're okay.
I'm okay?
Yeah, you've got a few more minutes if you
Few
want
more
to
minutes. So then I'll leave Professor Chris to give it the more scientific twist with his PowerPoint presentation and all that. Now let me conclude by saying, now, we all know about panda. It's very popular. Right? Panda symbolizes a friendly relationship between China and that country or that government. Only then they come and present you with a panda. It's very difficult to get panda from China. And once they never present to you. Actually, they loan it to you for a price, and you pay millions of dollars to have it in your zoo. Actually, it's true. If panda gives birth, the baby panda belongs to China, not to the zoo. But if you go to the most famous panda lab in Sichuan province, the panda lab is surrounded by 70% of Tibetan villages. So panda lab, rather the place where panda grow, is Tibetan area. So by that we can conclude that panda is a Tibetan bear. So that's why when you see panda, it's lovely, cuddly, and friendly. That's what Tibetans are. That's what Insolent Dalam expect us Tibetans to be lovely, cuddly, and friendly. Well, as far as China is concerned, if you attend any of the New Year, they have dragon dance. They don't have panda dance. So dragon represents China, which breathes fire. But I was told that Chinese dragon don't breathe fire. It's the European dragon that breathes fire. But nonetheless, dragon is China's animal, panda is ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, there were a few things to think about, quite terrifying statistics there. Professor, would you like to?
Yes, I do. Can I just check on this one? It gives me a little bit more flexibility. Excellent. Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, Mr. President. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. You heard a little bit about my career. I'm a professor here at University College London. I previously ran the Science Museum, but very early in my career, I worked with rockets and satellites. I was formerly a rocket scientist, and I've always felt that gives me permission to speak with authority on a very wide range of subjects. But in this particular instance, on climate change, I have spent something like 30 years or more trying to understand how the planet works, and indeed, let me get this working. That's very strange. So sorry, let me try and get my slides going.
Chris, we are refusing to go from the screen.
Yeah, we had this working before, so let me just do it one more time.
Do we have a technical person?
We have a technical person. Oh, wait a minute, how about that?
Yes,
Boom,
you've done
there we go.
it.
Right. That's what a rocket scientist can do. So, a few days ago, a very interesting event took place. You heard from Sangay that the jet stream has a big impact on the weather conditions that we see all over the world. And a big loop formed in the jet stream, and it wafted very warm air, unusually early in the year, over Greenland. And you may know that Greenland has an enormous ice sheet on it. And there was an unprecedented level of melting on the Greenland ice sheet just a few days ago. 40% of the surface of the entire ice sheet was melting, which was absolutely shocking to the polar scientists who studied this. This is unprecedented in the satellite record. This is actually a picture not taken on top of the ice sheet. It's taken on a sheet of ice which is floating on the ocean just off the coast. But it too suffered an unusual degree of melting, and so this photograph was taken by a researcher who had expected to be sledding across a solid surface of ice, but they found themselves sledding across this, what looks like a lake. Actually looks like the dogs are walking on water. So this was completely unprecedented and very startling. Temperatures were 10 to 20 degrees centigrade warmer than they would otherwise have been. So this sort of thing is a signal. The planet is sending us messages. It's saying, do you know what? Some very strange things are going on. So as a space scientist, rocket scientist, I spent a lot of time early in my career working with the space agencies to develop satellite systems to study the Earth. So I like this image. It's an image of the Earth, but it's taken not in light, but it's taken in thermal infrared. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of buildings and people where you're looking at the heat radiation coming from them. And so this image is of the heat radiation that the planet is radiating away into space to cool itself off. And over its long 4.5 billion year history, the rate of loss of energy to space has balanced almost perfectly the energy that the planet is picking up from the sun. It's intercepting the light and heat from the sun. And that balance is very important, and it's almost perfect. If you look at this image, the white areas are very high altitude clouds. They're quite cold. And the dark areas are where heat is coming up through what would be the transparent part of the atmosphere. But if you look carefully, something is missing. You can't actually see the surface. And the reason you can't see the surface is that the atmosphere is opaque at these heat wavelengths. If we were looking with light, we would be able to see the continents and the ocean and the rivers and the lakes underneath, but you can't. And so this is a direct demonstration of what's known as the greenhouse effect, which I'm sure you've all heard about. Because there are very small quantities of water vapour, carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, minuscule quantities, they make the atmosphere opaque to heat radiation. If they weren't there, if it was just the nitrogen and oxygen, the atmosphere would be transparent to that heat, the heat would make it straight from the surface out to space, and the surface would be 30 degrees centigrade cooler than it is. So the average temperature of the surface is plus 15 degrees at present. If those small quantities of greenhouse gases weren't there, the surface would be minus 15 degrees centigrade. It would be frozen over, and you and I would not be here. So the greenhouse effect is a good thing. But if you add carbon dioxide, or if you add greenhouse gases to make the atmosphere more opaque, then you will make that temperature difference between the bottom of the atmosphere and the top of the atmosphere greater. And that is what we're doing. I checked on the what's called the Daily CO2 website just now, and it says that on June the 18th, so 3 days ago, it's the latest data, from a measuring station right in the middle of the Pacific, where the atmosphere is not polluted by industrial emissions, the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere was 414 units, 114 parts per million. And that's more than 100 units greater than the natural level that the system settles at in an interglacial. You know, we go through ice ages and interglacials. In an ice age, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere is about 180 units. In an interglacial, which is about 5 degrees warmer globally, it's 280 units, and we're now at 415 units. And all of that additional CO2 has been pumped into the atmosphere quite inadvertently and unwittingly. We didn't do it on purpose, but by our burning of fossil fuels. And that is what has upset the energy balance of the planet. So as we speak, because of this extra CO2 in the atmosphere and other consequences, the Earth is gathering energy from the sun at a rate which is greater than it's managing to radiate it away into space. We're preventing it from cooling itself off by radiating that energy away. And it's as if every person on the planet, 7.5 billion of us, 7.7 billion of us, had 20 1.5 kilowatt kettles, and which we had constantly on, pouring hot water into the ocean. Because that's where most of the energy goes. About 94% of it goes into the ocean. So we have upset the energy balance of the planet. And interestingly, the rate at which the Earth is gathering additional energy is about 20 times greater than the entire energy production of humanity to run the modern world. So when you're doing something that has 20 times the consequence, you have to ask yourself whether what you're doing is very sensible. Now, this dial here is a clock, like a clock, but instead of the hours of the day round the outside of it, it's got the months of the year. So January, February, March, April, May. It goes round in a circle. And the central white circle is where temperatures were running round the year, January, February, March, through the seasons, in the late 19th century. So it starts at about 1850. And the two red lines are the boundaries that the international community agreed in Paris in 2015 should be the guardrails or limits beyond which we should not go in terms of warming the planet. So the aim is to keep as close as possible to 1.5 degrees, which is the inner circle, and definitely not to go outside the second circle, the 2-degree one, because that's where it's deemed that climate change will become significantly dangerous, and I'll explain why in a minute. So what I'm going to show you is an animation of the data that we have over that period. So you see, in the late 19th century, temperatures were more or less round at that baseline. As we move into the middle of last century, things start to warm up. And then as we get into the 1970s onwards, what is called the Great Acceleration, you see that the annual temperatures move further and further out to this 1.5 degree limit. So these data run up to 2017, 2 years ago. Last year was as warm as 2017. It will run again in a second. So what you can see is that year by year by year, as we run through the months of the year, the world has been warming up to the point where we are already getting desperately close to the guardrails that we have set, beyond which warming will be dangerous. Now, because we've upset the energy balance, there are a series of consequences. So you've seen the world warms. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming and way beyond any level of natural variability. Of course there are natural fluctuations, but this is way outside what we would see from nature. So the world warms, and as a polar scientist, which I've spent a lot of my career involved in, either watching from space or going there directly, we know that if you warm ice and snow, which is near the melting point, then there's an absolutely certain consequence: the ice and snow will melt. And so you see ice and snow melting at the North Pole. I showed you that image of what happened just a few days ago. Ice melts at the South Pole, Antarctica, and ice melts at high altitudes in the Himalayas and the other mountain ranges of the world. So ice and snow melt, we'll come back to that, but that's an inevitability. Because some of that water and some of that ice discharges into the sea levels rise. And the planet is a big place and the oceans are vast. And yet, over the last century, the entire sea level of the globe raised about 20 centimetres, 2/3 of which was water and ice delivered from the polar regions and high altitudes, and the rest was because the ocean was warming and the water expanded. So sea levels rise, and of course that has consequences for coastal communities and cities all over the world. Because the poles warm faster than the equator, it changes the temperature distribution across the planet, and that causes the circulation of the fluids, the atmosphere and the ocean, to change. And of course it's the atmosphere that delivers rainfall and cloud cover and wind to the agricultural areas of the world, and so that will have consequences. That physical change will have biological consequences. In addition, a warmer atmosphere can carry more moisture. For every degree warmer, the atmosphere can carry 7% more water. So we call the water cycle accelerates. So more water is drawn out of the ocean and the ground, interestingly making the areas that it's drawn from on the ground drier, and so making desertification worse. But then that extra rainfall is deposited in much more intense rainfall, which then does damage to the surface by erosion and by flooding. So the water cycle accelerates. Extreme weather events like tropical cyclones increase in their intensity, not necessarily in their number, but in their intensity. Ecosystems, the biology, respond. That means that food and water supplies are affected. Infrastructure is damaged by the direct effects of these changes, and economic and political stability are affected. When very large numbers of people are driven from areas because those areas are no longer agriculturally sustainable, or because they suffer from extreme flooding or fires, then the boundaries that are drawn all over the world become extremely important. And you've seen that part of the problem that we have in the UK at present with Brexit was a concern about migration, which caused people to take the decisions that they did. So in our small way, we're already seeing the effects of migration having a massive political impact here. And part of that, not all of it, but part of it was driven by climate change, particularly in the Middle East. So people and species are impacted. And so what I've drawn here is that there are this chain of consequences, but it's not a linear chain, a cascade as I've shown it, because things that happen down the cascade feed back on the original causes. So you have this complex set of interactions in this highly coupled system. The ocean, the atmosphere, the ice, the biology, the economy, the people are all interconnected, all living creatures. And so this whole system is responding to this shock of the increased energy flow in, the reduced energy flow out, and the fact that the energy is accumulating and causing all of these consequences. So it's very difficult for the climate science community to predict exactly what will happen. We know in general what will happen, but the system is so complex that it always has the capacity to surprise. Now, serious people have been thinking about this for a long time, and that includes the military and the security services. So based on work done more than 5 years ago, the US Department of Defense published what they called their 2014 Climate Change Adaptation Roadmap. And in it, they said rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, and more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. Climate change is a threat multiplier. In a world that already has many, many problems, climate change makes things worse, not better. Now, the only word that I would disagree with in this statement is the word will. Because even when this was written, there was plenty of evidence that these things were already happening. But what we've seen in the last 5 years is more and more evidence that this is already happening, it's already amongst us. And it's not just happening in distant parts of the world, although it is happening all over the globe, but there's a tendency to feel that this must be happening to somebody else, somewhere else in the future. It's happening now, and it's happening to all of us, and it's having its consequences. And if you happen to be a homeowner in California at present, you will find that you cannot insure your property if it's anywhere near a forested area, and there are vast areas that are now uninsurable. So this is not just happening to the poor people in the world, it's happening to the rich people as well, which is why perhaps we're seeing more attention paid to it as an issue. But probably the biggest consequence and the most difficult consequence to manage and the most dangerous consequence in the long term will be the fact that large areas of the planet will become uninhabitable and that people will be driven to move to new areas. And you can just imagine that where many of the nations involved have nuclear weapons, this is an extremely worrying and threatening issue. It's as if we were trying to shift a delicate balance. We can push it a little way and it will recover, it has the capacity to recover, but if we're not careful we can push it too far and the whole edifice can collapse. Now that's particularly pertinent because in addition to the direct effects of climate change, which are to some degree manageable both by adaptation and by limiting the warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees beyond which we hope we won't go, the climate science community has identified processes and hotspots around the world in this complex interconnected system where if you push too far, then the edifice will collapse, all of those stones will fall off. And you've already heard about the potential for releasing methane and carbon dioxide, but methane in particular from permafrost and also from what are known as clathrates, compounds of ice and methane in the shallow Arctic seas. And we're seeing this process already starting. There was a report very recently about how researchers in Canada were flabbergasted this year to see how much of the permafrost, which they had not expected to begin to melt for something like 70 years, how much of it is already showing signs of thawing out. So if that methane is released, then it's one example of where we no longer have control. The planet then takes over, and the additional methane added to the atmosphere will have its warming effect, and there is essentially nothing we can do about it. We have no means of drawing that methane back out of the atmosphere, certainly not at present. And what this diagram here shows that there are many other areas of the system that represent similar sorts of tipping points, changes in the way the ocean circulation works, dieback of major forest areas, greening of the Sahara, which again will change precipitation patterns, changes to the monsoon. All of these things, once triggered, cannot be stopped. So that is why it's so important that we don't go beyond these guardrails. Now, we've heard about the Himalayan system, the fact that the glaciers of the Himalayas, just like the glaciers of other mountain ranges, but particularly the Himalayas, are a precious resource which humans are exploiting and have learned to exploit. Because the major rivers of the world, delivering water to anywhere between 1 and 2 billion people in this case, rely on that system. It's interesting actually, it's not so much the stored ice that has mattered in the past, because there's been an annual cycle of deposition of ice and snow over the winter, which is then melted throughout the spring and summer. And so it's delivered water in a measured way throughout the agricultural growings, the summer, spring and summer, both in China, India and so on, the areas that you can see on this map. But two things are happening. The amount of water that's being deposited in the winter as snow and ice is changing, both the total and the fall. If it falls as rain in the winter and discharges down the rivers, then it's no longer available later in the year for agriculture or industry or drinking water. And in addition, as you've heard, the glaciers are melting, so they're delivering more water at present, often too much, but in the long term they won't be there as a reserve to deliver water that's needed for these purposes. Now, I find it interesting, I've taken this slide from Al Gore's presentation, Inconvenient Truth, which was delivered 13 years ago. So this is hardly a new concept. It's been known for at least that long. Al Gore put his talk together advised by people. He didn't just do it in 2013. He had bright people telling him what the key issues were. So it's not as if this is a surprise. We've known about it for a long time. But what is a surprise is the rate at which these changes are taking place, because they were not expected to be perceivable for a long time. And as we've heard, these effects impact on maybe 20% of the world's population. But in this year, we've had several reports. Firstly, there was a major report, the Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment, and associated with that, there was a report about a couple of months ago that said a third of the Himalayan ice cap is doomed, even if we stay within that 2-degree guardrail, is the estimate. Even if we stay within that guardrail, major changes will take place. And then this week, the report was released yesterday, this is yesterday's Guardian. A new report came out that said that the research community, rocket scientists, using newly released spy satellite data, have seen that the rate of retreat of the glaciers in the Himalayas has doubled in the last decade. So we're beginning to see very, very major changes happening very quickly and very suddenly. So this is very alarming. Now, at this point, we don't have time, but what we try to do often is help people through their bereavement curve, because it's difficult to hear these messages without feeling very strong emotional reactions of anxiety, fear, anger, and in particular a lack of agency, a feeling of helplessness. You know, what can I do about it as an individual? And it's important to try and help people through that. We all feel these things. Actually, climate scientists are the best at disavowing, because if we really confronted what we know, it would be difficult for us to operate as human beings, and there are worries about the mental health state of climate scientists, because they know what is coming down the road, and they tend to try and set it to one side, because it's just very frightening. So it's important to look at the good news. So in 2015, you know that the nations of the world met in Paris, and 186 nations agreed a common goal, that we will work together collectively to try and hold temperatures to well below 2 degrees, not to go beyond those guardrails. Having a goal is a good thing, but it's even better if you have a plan about how you're going to do that. And so they put together a collective plan to cut anthropogenic emissions and to achieve a balance of removals by sinks in the second half of the 21st century. To the point where we know adding CO2 to the atmosphere, which is well and good. But unfortunately, what the science community were able to calculate afterwards was that the voluntary pledges that those 186 nations put on the table and committed to were only sufficient to achieve about a 3-degree warming by the end of the century. So not to keep below 2 degrees, not to keep at 1.5, but to keep to 3 degrees rather than the 4 degrees or more that we would have gone to if those pledges hadn't been made. And what we've seen is that some nations are doing very well, they're keeping to their pledges, they're on track, but other nations aren't. And an interesting case is the United States, where President Trump, who doesn't believe that this is an issue at all, has formally attempted to withdraw the United States from the agreement. But the United States is a complicated place, and interestingly, at the state level and the city level, that has had the counterbalancing effect of energizing people who believe that this is a big problem to take even stronger measures. So the United States is an interesting case to watch. But at present, we're certainly not on track to keep below those thresholds. And more reports, I can hardly keep up with them. There's hardly a week goes by without another 200-page report landing on my digital desktop. But this year, we've had reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the climate change community that look into this, from Shell, the oil company, who are very hot on this stuff and trying very hard to move to be an energy company, not an oil and gas company, from the American climate science community. And all of these messages say things are happening faster and faster, and we really, really are running out of time. If we don't take urgent action soon, then the chances of staying underneath that 2-degree guardrail will slip away from our hands, and we're perilously close to that point. So it's not surprising that some people have declared a climate emergency. So in the UK we have Extinction Rebellion, who I'm sure you've heard about, and who are pressing very hard for action. They're saying we cannot wait any longer. It tends to be young people, not entirely, but they see their future slipping away from them. In addition, there's been a shift in the conversation. What started as a scientific conversation, where scientists would show you graphs and tell you about measurements they made of CO2 and so on, which then moved into a technocratic discussion about, well, what green technologies can we use to deal with this, which then turned into an economic and political discussion, largely very negative, because the incumbent neoliberal ideologues really don't like the consequences of climate change, because it can only be handled through a UN-like body globally and with regulation and control, which of course is anathema to the free market. But it's now shifted to something else. Extinction Rebellion and others have shifted the conversation to it being a social movement. So it's equivalent to the abolition movement of the 19th century, the suffragettes of the 20th century, the civil rights movement. These are similar changes in the zeitgeist of society. And if you think of it, the abolitionists didn't say, we're going to reduce slavery by 20% by 1820 and 50% by 1835. They said, we're going to abolish slavery. And the suffragettes said, we're going to emancipate women, we're going to get them the vote. Not half of them, not 20% of them, the lot. And the civil rights movement said, we're going to overcome this injustice. So this has suddenly become a conversation about intergenerational injustice and global justice. But the intergenerational injustice, the planet that we leave future generations, is the most basic level of that injustice that people are now motivated to fight. And so this is why the student strikes, we've heard about Greta Thunberg and the massive movement that she's kicked off. This is all about abolishing fossil fuels. We have to abolish fossil fuels. Once we see that absolute objective, then we can talk about targets and trajectories and so on. But that is what we're facing. And this is why it's so encouraging that Theresa May, last week, as you may know, committed the UK to net zero by 2050 and to a substantial reduction over the next 12 years or so. So in answering the question, what can we do about it, Greta Thunberg, this one, she was 15 years old when she started this off, has shown that one 15-year-old voice can have an impact that is global. Every single one of us has the capacity to achieve something similar. And you also heard that I was involved with the BBC One programme. Authoritative figures like David Attenborough coming out and saying, do you know what, I've been watching what's been going on with the planet and the natural world for 50 years longer and have been presenting it to you. And do you know what, I've come to the conclusion that we're in a very serious situation and that we need to do something about it. So 15-year-olds and older people are all able to make their contribution. So now I don't want to overrun. So climate scientists in their professional positions will deliver you evidence and knowledge. You know, so we will look at an audience and we will say, what do I need to tell you so that you understand the situation? But actually, when you're dealing with a social movement, the question isn't what do you need to know, the question is what do you need to do? And so engaging with people not through delivering facts and evidence, but through a narrative, is a far more profitable way of engaging a conversation where we can all work out what it is that we can do that might be equivalent to David Attenborough or Greta Thunberg or whatever platform we have. And so storytelling is the natural way to do that, which is not the way that most scientists deliver their knowledge and understanding, but storytelling is powerful. And storytelling can be even more powerful if it's done in a theatrical setting, where you're not just addressing the head, but you're addressing the heart and you're addressing all of the other senses. So I had the opportunity, as you heard, a few years ago, 5 years ago now, to write a play with a professional playwright, Duncan Macmillan, and for that play to be staged by a brilliant producer and director, Katie Mitchell. And so we wrote the play, it was called 2071. So it was called 2071 because at the time that I was writing it, I was a certain age, I will not tell you quite what that was, but you can kind of guess. And my eldest granddaughter was 10 years old. And so she will be the age that I was when we wrote the play in 2071. And the idea is that I can imagine, she will be like me now. You know, she will feel and see the world in the way that I do. What world will we have left her? What legacy will we, through our actions, have left her? It's a very powerful way of connecting to the future. So I gave a kind of fireside chat monologue, and if I've got time, I'll perhaps read you a couple of quick bits. But I'll read you one short bit, right from the end. So you can get this if you want to. Don't get it on Amazon. You can buy it around the corner at Dylan's. So all this stuff. But the play essentially says a little bit of my story, and then why it is that I've concluded that this is such a serious issue, what the evidence is, and so on, and what we can do about it. And then at the end, I just reflect a little bit. So let me just pick this last little bit. There's quite a lot, by the way, on melting ice, so I was going to read you about that, but I don't have time. We're all dependent on energy. Almost everything we do depends upon it. There will be carbon atoms generated by this event, by our travel here, the electricity that we're using in this hall, that will still be in the air in 2071, in the air that my granddaughter will breathe. That and all of our other carbon dioxide emissions are our legacy, our gift to the future. Science cannot say what is right or what is wrong. Science can inform, but it can't arbitrate, it cannot decide. Science can say that if we burn another 500 billion tons of carbon, which is what we've done collectively so far, the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere will increase by another 100 parts per million, and that will almost certainly lead to a warming of the planet greater than 2 degrees centigrade, resulting in a major disruption of the climate system and huge risks for the natural world and human well-being. But science cannot answer moral questions, value questions. Do we care about the world's poor? Do we care about future generations? Do we see the environment as part of the economy, or the economy as part of the environment? The whole point about climate change is that despite having been revealed by science, it's not really an issue of science. It's an issue about what sort of a world we want to live in. What kind of a future do we want to create? So I'll stop there. As I say, if you're interested in the script, you can get hold of it. But I'll just finish with this picture of the balance. And it's incumbent on all of us to maintain that balance and not upset it. So thank you very much.
Absolutely fascinating. So many burning questions, I'm sure, in the audience. I mean, I certainly wanted to ask you about China before we go forward, because I think that was just one part that I think we just didn't quite get to, which is that given the self-interest of China in preserving what's going on in Tibet, what is happening? I mean, are they, apart from just taking resources, is China cooperating with the Tibetans at all in this?
At the Paris Accord, because US withdrew, and the Chinese leader was touted or presented as the leader of the climate change. So, and many of the news media repeated the line, and Chinese leaders also, claimed that title. But actually, if you analyze the performance in Tibet, the record is not so good. As I said, because of the urbanization of the Tibetan Plateau, because they are sending a lot of Chinese to the Tibetan area. But fortunately, because of the Tibetan altitude, which is 4,000 meters on average, it's very cold in winter. So they come in summer, and during winter, most of the Chinese migrants go back. So, and then in other areas, like Inner Mongolia and the southern part of Xinjiang, and other minority areas, Chinese migrants have moved in and permanently settled. As far as Tibetan Plateau is concerned, because of its altitude and cold weather, we are prevented. So, we wish climate change and Algo all the best, but we are not a big fan of global warming. As long as Earth is cold, Tibetan Plateau is cold, and Chinese migrants are not settled. So it depends on
That's your
and
altitude sickness, perhaps.
I think there's one example. Up to 1 million nomads were forcibly removed from the mountains, and they were told that because of overgrazing, there's desertification happening on the Tibetan Plateau on the grassland, so nomads had to be forcibly removed and settled in ghetto-like situation, what they call preserved grassland. But after 10 years or 20 years or so, the Chinese mining company moves in and extract minerals from the same area. There's a case of Rapley area where that's exactly what happened. I think there are documentaries about Inner Mongolia also. Many of the grasslands were taken over, but then the Chinese mining companies move in and extract minerals. So that's why, I think Chinese record as far as climate change is concerned, their performance in Tibet is not good at all.
Great. Well, let's throw it open to the floor, because I'm sure a lot of you have questions. Yes, that gentleman here.
Second.
Just wait for the microphone. Do you need the microphone?
Second, in 1924, Sir Henry Hayden made a report for the Tibetan government and said what minerals were in Tibet. Even before that, China called it the Western Treasure House. Why would China, with its need for growth, if it doesn't have growth, its people will rebel and they will destroy the CCP? Why will they stop exploiting Tibet?
As you rightly said, Tibet in Chinese, Xizang, means Western treasure. So obviously, now they have found out so many minerals are there because of the forest and water. So that's why actually they occupied Tibet to extract all these things. So Tibetan area is as big as 2.5 million square kilometers of land, which is as big as Western Europe. So it's a huge tract of land. And China has 1.3 billion Han-Chinese, and Tibetan Plateau, which is almost 1/4, at least 1/5 of China as a territory, a huge tract of land. So clearly they wanted the land for Chinese people to move in, and there are all the minerals and natural resources.
Okay.
Oh, I'm going to go back to
So I won't be turfed out. Any more questions? There were so many questions surely about what we need to do.
Hello. Yes, I'm interested to know more about Indigenous leadership with these issues in Tibet and whether there is a role that Indigenous leaders play in climate policies in Tibet.
Yeah, I think very little. Because Tibet is controlled by China, which means Han Chinese are in the leadership positions. So if you look at the political apparatus, security apparatus, clearly, and also the economic structure is dominated by Chinese people. For example, in the capital city of Lhasa, you can estimate up to 90% of the enterprises, be it rickshaw puller license, to saloon, to travel agency, to restaurant, hotel, all are owned or run by Chinese. So that's the business side. And as far as security, obviously, army and police are controlled by Chinese. And even the political structure, the party secretary, who is the most powerful person, has never been a Tibetan. And the standing committee of the Communist Party, which at one time, I don't know exactly this year, at one time had 13 people, and of which 7 were Han Chinese. Now, of the remaining 6, 1 or 2 were half Chinese, married to Chinese, like that, you see. So they are in full control. As far as Tibetans are concerned, they have very little say. Now,
so no role for sort of indigenous ideas for what to do about the environment?
Very, very, very little. That's why when nomads were removed from the grassland, and they said because of desertification or overgrazing, but actually Tibetan nomads have been there for hundreds of thousands of years. It's their livelihood. They know how to balance it, how much to graze, how much not to graze. But then quote-unquote Chinese scientists came and said you're overgrazing and this is disturbing, and you have to be removed. But clearly, it was for other purpose like mining. So Tibetans have very little say. And as far as we are concerned, we are not against mining per se. What we say is whatever you do, it has to be environmentally sustainable, culturally respectful, because we have so many sacred mountains and sacred rivers, and economically beneficial to the Tibetan people. Now, Presently, what they're doing is neither environmentally sustainable or economically beneficial to the Tibetan people, and they're definitely not respecting Tibetan culture. So even the sacred mountains and the sacred rivers are exploited.
There is clearly danger of climate change, but individually, today after this we go home, what can one individual can do? What can we do?
Okay.
Some steps can we just
Yes, it's the clear question. It's the question that is in everybody's heads when they hear about climate change. And the response that I always used to give, and it's still a starting point, is to say, well, there are at least 3 different aspects of your life where you can have an impact. There's your personal life, and you can ride a bicycle, you can eat less meat. There are lots of ways that you can reduce your own personal environmental impact. And this enhances your self-respect. You may influence others, but the planet almost certainly won't notice because you're just one atomic small person in a vast system. But it's important to do. And can I say, it must never become a tyranny. I occasionally have people come up after I give a talk and say, well, it's all very well, but I hear you flew on an airplane. And my answer to that is, as politely as possible, well, really, it's not any of your business. I interrogate my conscience, and I decide whether or not something that I invest carbon in is worth it or not. We're all part of this carbon-intensive society. It's not our fault. The power and energy that fossil fuels have delivered to us have transformed all of our lifestyles. I mean, we live at a level of a quality of life that is unheard of in human history. But now that we have, and it was completely unwitting that we let the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we didn't realise that it was going to be so damaging. But now that we know that it is, we need to do something about it. But it shouldn't become a tyranny. People shouldn't look around and start pointing fingers at people. We should say, do you know what? Now that we know that there's a problem, we all need to have a discussion about how to deal with it. So in your personal life, there are things you can do. If you're employed, in your professional life, there are things that you can do. And for the same amount of effort that you invest in your personal life, you may have a much bigger impact through your professional life. Because if you're part of an organisation, it has structures, it has budgets, it has influence, it has connections. And so there are many, many examples of people within organisations having a big impact. Obviously, the higher up you are in the hierarchy, the bigger the impact you may be able to have, but everybody can have some impact. But then the third piece, so personal, professional, but the third piece is political. And I brief House of Commons committees, and until quite recently, the standard comment that I've come across is, well, do you know what, Chris, what you're saying is almost certainly right. Not everybody agrees, but most do. But we can tell you that our mailbags, our email bags, are full of concerns from our voters about the economy, about the National Health Service, about this, that, and the rest of it. Very, very rarely do we get a comment and a concern about climate change. Now that's changed recently, and you've seen that all of a sudden all sorts of politicians who weren't prepared to stand up and comment on climate change even a few months ago are now suddenly desperately green and showing their green credentials. So that demonstrates that using political clout in a free country, in a democratic country, which we are still just about clinging on, you can have that influence. But in the end, the conversation that we need to have is a personal one. So we need to sit down and say, well, in that array of possibilities, where in your life do you think by investing effort you could have the biggest impact? And when we've identified that, rather than giving you a kind of smorgasbord of stuff, personal, political, professional, all that stuff, when you've got one thing that you've identified, it's harder tomorrow morning for you to wake up and think, oh, well, I've got my life to lead, that was all great last night, but I've got other priorities now. If there's one thing that's been identified, then it's harder for you to ignore it, and it gnaws away at your conscience, and in the end you may do something. So I would ask that in answer to that question, everybody in the audience asks themselves the question, well, what could I do? Look at what Greta Thunberg did. You know, she decided she was going to sit down and take no more of it, and she's had an enormous impact. What would be the equivalent that you could have? And when you've thought of it, don't wake up tomorrow morning and go and do something else. Continue to think about it.
But what about the speed, though? I mean, we're both talking about time running out. The Paris Agreement is not enough. The last half of this century isn't enough to start doing something. So where, you know, people can go and do demonstrations, but how do you actually get into this different economy at a speed that's going to make a difference?
Al Gore says there's no silver bullet, but there's silver buckshot. We need all of the above. We need everything. And again, you know, it sounds silly, but every little helps. It's the mobilisation of very large numbers of people that will drive that acceleration. And I think that there are tipping points in the social world as well as in the natural world. And I sense that the way things have been changing over the last few months, we're getting to a tipping point where the pressure will be so great that something has to be done about it. And go back to the slavery, the abolitionists, the women's emancipation. There came a point where the things shifted and the public opinion shifted to the point where they're not going to tolerate that lack of action.
And surely, I would imagine with India and China having such a vast interest in the preservation of the Tibetan Plateau, is there a tipping point there? Would they just say, look, we've got to do something to preserve the environment?
And that's what even Chinese environmentalists are telling Chinese leaders. They say Tibetan Plateau is so important. Forget the rest of the world in Asia. For us, the Chinese people, now it's up to the Chinese leaders, you know, to listen to, because they have conflicting interests. All these Chinese companies, you know, mining companies and others, and then hydropower. Right? They all are going there and exploiting.
Yes, the political stability of China depends on Tibet's environment being safe. If the Yangtze floods starts flooding every year, or if the water dries up, or the Yellow River dries up, I mean,
that's
it's
true.
a huge issue.
If only leaders think long term and act on a long term basis. For example, China has 19% of the world population, but only 12% of fresh water. So already, the 7% of Chinese population, which is equivalent to 400 million or so, are facing water scarcity, mainly in the northeast area. Now, the situation in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India is worse. Right? Now, Tibet is the water tower. Now, and China is thinking of quick fix. They're thinking of diverting rivers, which are flowing downstream towards China. This is more quick fix, right? That's why, conveniently, now there's something called UN Convention on Water Sharing, that countries should share their water with neighboring countries. But China conveniently did not sign the UN Convention on Water Sharing. So, and then because now some experts have called, you know, water white goods. So before wars were fought over land, nowadays wars are fought over oil or gas. Soon wars will be fought over water because it's crucial. For example, just today, there was CNN front page news. The 6th largest city in India, Chennai, is running out of water, and there is protests going on all over the place. Now, as far as what we can do, there is obviously from industrialization point of view, or the macro level, there is solar power, wind power, electric power, all these are coming out. So that, if you quicken the pace, that is something. But individual level, you know, what I do is, you know, if, when some people come to see me in my office in the evening after 5, they say, you know, Sintong, I can't see your face because I don't turn on my light in my office. I said, you come to see my face, but have you talked to me? So I've come to talk to you. As long as we hear each other, we don't have to see our faces. Now, don't turn on the light unless it's necessary. Now, Tibetan administration, we have sent a directive notice to all the offices to turn off the light from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. If you can, turn off the light from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So, I mean, bring daylight, you know, if you have enough in the window, and then if enough light gets into the room, you don't need to turn on the light. So, from a global warming point of view, we are turning on too many bulbs.
There are many examples at the individual and institutional level where it's been found to be really simple to save 25% of your energy budget and not change your quality of performance or life at all.
And individually, I think many of the people in this room have left their charger plugged. And you're wasting a lot of energy because the electric current goes in that. It's true, from the plug, it goes to the wire, it goes back. In the process, you're wasting a lot of electricity.
I have one small question.
So you forgot your charger?
Always happy or argue with people. You know that the game of is the hot and cold playing games, yeah, in the atmosphere, and there is fluctuation all over the world. No doubt, there is a fluctuation, extreme fluctuation. But the world is getting hotter and hotter and never going back.
Yeah.
Is that the situation?
Yes. So for example, if humans hadn't released all of this additional carbon dioxide, we would be gently at this point drifting back towards the next ice age. It's a very slow process. And this interglacial, for one reason or another, would have been a much longer one than normal. It would have been about 50,000 years. So it would be a very gentle glide slope into the next ice age. But by adding what we have, this additional carbon dioxide, we won't go into another ice age now. The planet is moving into a different state, into a warm state. Can I just say something, if I may? It may be a bit controversial in this audience, but one thing that about the Chinese administration, I'm not sure if it's still true today, but certainly over the last decades, there has been a significant qualitative difference between the Chinese leadership and many of the other leaderships around the world, in that they tend to have been trained as geologists or scientists or engineers. So they have understood this issue firsthand, and they have, whether or not they have been doing sufficient, but they have acknowledged that climate change is an issue. And indeed, as you said, China, of all the countries in the world, is feeling the effects of climate change on its agriculture in ways that others aren't. And the move towards being dominant in the generation of green technology and so on has been partly driven by that. And the corollary is that we see in this country, where the majority of our politicians have PPE degrees from Oxford, the most useless degree you could ever get anywhere, say from UCL. And I have briefed British politicians on climate change. And interestingly, the only two who really showed any glimmer of understanding of what life enough were Margaret Thatcher and Peter Mandelson. I won't tell you the others, but by and large it's a very uphill struggle. I will mention one because she's a candidate for becoming the Prime Minister, who's totally disinterested and unbriefable on the subject. So there are nations in the world where whether or not the political power is used, the political power that is at least on tap because of a level of understanding of the issue that you don't find elsewhere. And of course President Trump is another example of somebody who clearly has not engaged with it.
Quickly take all three questions together.
Yeah. Should we take the three questions?
Here.
Yeah.
One quick question, because you said, well, Tibet is a cold country. I wanted to know what is the main source of energy over there. The Chinese, of course, are leaders in solar energy, and do you benefit from that at all?
Tibetan Plateau is used for solar energy, to produce solar energy.
So
And Tibet has a lot of major rivers and hydropower, and they are selling it, rather they are selling it to the neighboring provinces or states within China. So hydropower is a major issue as well, and wind power too. And at the back.
So just this gentleman here. Hang on a second. Just a second. Hold on.
My question is to the professor. I don't normally quote Mahatma Gandhi, but Mahatma Gandhi said, the world can provide for humans' need, but cannot provide for humans' greed. Now the statistics which is shown from 1850 really started the industrialization, inter-civilization. And the upshoot of that is the increase in population, probably by 10 billion more people. And the consumerism theory and the practice that we do has so much effect that what matter, however the climate people say, unless these checks are drawn back, which is almost impossible, how would you address?
So we're looking at a different economic model, is what you're saying.
Well, very quickly, the impact of humans on the planet is the multiplication of the number of people times their economic activity times the quality of the technology that they use to decarbonize what they're doing. So as the population has gone up, more than doubled in my lifetime, and as the economy has grown, more than quadrupled in my lifetime, you have to compensate for that by decarbonizing your technology, and it's very hard for technology to keep up with those rapid increases. Now, unfortunately, demography is such a slow process that we have missed our chance of keeping the population at a level where we might have been able to cope. So, and there are natural factors, the various factors that have already caused the replacement rate to be reached by most nations. So the population will sort of peak and then die away. We can no longer control that. It will peak at somewhere between 9 and 12 billion, depending on individual factors. So really, and it's very difficult to persuade people to reduce the economy. Try telling that to any politician, you know, they're not interested. So the only way that we can handle this is to decarbonize what we do. That's how we have to do it. And that's why net zero is so important.
One last question at the back there, then I feel we'll have to stop.
Hi, I wanted to thank both the speakers, Sekyog and Professor Chris, for their talks. And I had a question for Professor Chris regarding UK politics, if you could enlighten us a bit more. So it's commendable that the UK Parliament actually declared a climate emergency after such a sustained Extinction Rebellion movement. But I was just wondering, how do they deal with things like private companies in the UK owning mining lands in Africa, and plus organizations like British Museum having, you know, deals with fossil fuel companies, and obviously the wars that they're waging, although they did pass a legislation saying that they're going to reconsider selling arms to Saudi. I think that was it. So
well, you're opening up an enormous box.
I know, but is the UK government even thinking about these issues at all, or?
But two quick points. Firstly, companies taking things very seriously, and there is in British law and American law, there's a concept known as reasonable foreseeability, and climate change is sufficiently well evidenced now that the boards of major companies are becoming much more engaged in ensuring that they don't have stranded assets, carbon bubbles, and indeed trying to divest from carbon-intensive and resource-intensive companies because of the ethical pressure put on them both by their shareholders and by other people and by Extinction Rebellion. So there's some good news there, but the fact that we live in a globalised world makes it very difficult to completely handle the sort of issue that you were talking with. The UK can be proud of being the first nation in the world to pass a legal act to reduce its carbon emissions, the 2008 Climate Change Act, and also having demonstrated the lie that you cannot decarbonise and at the same time grow the economy. The economy has grown 40% and our reduction in carbon emissions is the other way around. The economy has grown 60% and our carbon emissions are in situ carbon emissions have reduced 40%. If you take into account the carbon emissions embedded in the stuff that we buy, then we've been more or less plateaued. But you've opened up a big box there that would take a long time.
There's a lot more things we could discuss, but I did promise that we'd end at... Oh, Liz, did you want to have a quick...
I think the professor said many of the Chinese leaders have engineering background.
Yeah.
And also the geology.
Yes.
Because of that, they are more sensitive to environmental issues. But if you're an engineer, you want to build things, yeah. You don't want to protect things. And then I can give you a comparative example. In the whole world, you have 50,000 dams.
In China, 23,000 dams. Of the 50,000 dams, we have 23,000 in China. So Professor, engineers, environmentalist as the president of China.
So what we need is degrees in sustainability to we want those people to become our politicians. Great, well thank you so much. I think we're really going to have to finish now. Professor Chris Rapley, thank you so much. And CPO and Dr. Lobsang Sangay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My turn is to say the vote of thanks. I am the chairperson of Tibetan Community in Britain, as well as one of the trustees of Tibetan Refugee Charitable Trust. Rightly said, I am chairperson. I sit on the chair. All the works are done by my council. Particularly today, this fantastic event was spearheaded by Luchula. Really, I'm immensely proud of you. Therefore, I'm a leader who leads from behind. All my council has done the fantastic job, and I'm here to say thank you for all of my council. That is one. Secondly, without the cooperation from Office of Tibet, to have this occasion, so a big thanks to Office of Tibet. And today, another event we had another event, our sponsors. We sponsor 83 I was told. 83 children, Tibetan children in India. So big thanks to all the sponsors and also all the invited guests, all the guests who are here. Without you, this event won't be possible. Now, finally, I want to say big thanks to our two speakers and the moderator. And as a token of gesture, we want to present a Tibetan scarf. Before I do that, and as you said that when you go back, you have something to take away, I am definite. Think globally, act locally. And I hope we will not be able, like Ladakh, where I am from, every village is dedicated in building ice stupa, not the red stupa. So, the water scarcity, please keep in mind that. Please, we have a scarf for the speakers. Thank you very much for